Olá, bem-vindas e bem-vindos. Eu sou a Mariana Almeida e este é o McKinsey Talks direto do estúdio da McKinsey em São Paulo. O episódio de hoje vai falar sobre ela, que é o centro nervoso do sistema econômico internacional, a cadeia de suprimentos. Essa grande jornada interconectada na qual matérias-primas são transformadas em componentes, produtos e mercadorias, foi o grande palco da globalização nas últimas décadas. Antes, o objetivo dos líderes globais era construir cadeias com o menor custo absoluto, supondo que tudo desse certo. Mas o mundo mudou. Uma pesquisa do McKinsey Global Institute mostra que a cada 10 anos, cerca de 40% do lucro de um ano é perdido por interrupções da cadeia de suprimentos. Na média, isso dá 4% ao ano. Mas imprevisto não marca a hora. As disrupções são cada vez mais frequentes e existem também agora as pressões pela descarbonização, ou seja, um novo modelo se fez necessário. Para contornar os imprevistos e ter maior visibilidade, a cadeia de suprimentos atual almeja produtividade com resiliência, ou seja, com opções flexíveis e tomada de decisões ágeis e otimizadas. E assim, essas cadeias estão também, então, cada vez mais complexas de gerir. E para falar sobre isso, como será esse próximo capítulo do comércio internacional, temos aqui conosco no estúdio o Lapo Mori, sócio da McKinsey baseado em Denver e um dos nossos grandes especialistas em transformação de cadeia de suprimentos. Por isso, a nossa conversa hoje será em inglês. Welcome, Lapo. It's such a pleasure to have you here today with us.
A pleasure to be here.
Great. E para falar da cadeia de suprimentos em terras nacionais, temos aqui também o Edson Guimarães, sócio associado da McKinsey em São Paulo e líder da prática de supply chain no Brasil. Olá, Edson, bem-vindo aqui conosco também.
Olá, Mari, muito obrigado.
Muito bem. So let's get started. Lapo, please can you give us an overview which market dynamics are leading to supply chain resilience and sustainability?
There's a number of factors that are compounding each other. First one I would say is volatile markets. And we have seen over the last 2 years, COVID, we have seen significant changes in inflations, and all these things come together with other factors that are more linked to the business. First one is globalization. Globalization together with geopolitical risk. You put the two together, it's a very complex dynamics that you get out of that. And thirdly, if you look at supply chains, they're becoming increasingly longer and increasingly interlinked. So you have physical flows that are going very far from your operations and are dependent on many different players. And finally, there has been significant shifts in what customers are looking for. If you look at environmental impact and also attention that regulators are giving to that topic, that creates additional stress to supply chains.
Yeah, great. Yeah, these last 2 years were very challenging indeed.
Indeed.
So Edson, which sectors are mostly affected by this trend? And would you add any specifics about Brazil?
So, Mari, I think you have mentioned already that it is expected that 40% of EBITDA of 1 year, right, of companies will be lost in the next decade due to disruptions in the supply chain, right? And disregarding if Brazil or not, I think the way to see is the sectors that are most affected are those with largely globalized supply chain. And it's important to have in mind that most of the companies nowadays, due to the strategy over the last decades, they are globalized, right? Also, if you think on sectors that they have very long cycles, long lead times to buy components and so on and so forth, this is actually those that will be most affected. As an example, right? Agri industries, mining companies, they have like largely global supply chain flows and also long cycles, long lead times that they deal on daily basis, right? So these sectors, as well as automotive, aerospace, which also have beyond being global supply chains, they also have a lot of complexity due to the amount of components as well as the type of components that they use in their production. So these are the most affected sectors for sure.
So it's impressive how things changed, because globalizing the supply chain was a great deal then, and now everything changed.
Absolutely.
Okay. So Edson, when a company is aiming to build a resilient supply chain or to make an existing supply chain more resilient, which dimensions must be considered?
So there are a few dimensions to consider, and I would segregate it in internal and external dimensions, right? On the internal side, one thing that is super important is to expand your risk function, right? Typically, companies, they have only a risk perspective over their finance, for example. But nowadays, you need actually to create transparency on your whole value chain, right? And not only having the transparency of what are the weak points on the supply chain, but also have, let's say, troubleshooting actions, meaning if something goes out of ordinary, what should I do? Right? If a very important component for my production, if I miss it one day, what should I do? What should I produce? Should I maximize margin? Should I, let's say, focus on my key clients? So this is a very important point, expanding the risk function beyond, the typical finance perspective.
Having a B plan.
Absolutely. That's the point, because this is something that changed during COVID, right? Many companies, they faced a situation that they never had lived before. So knowing what are the weak points and how to tackle them when something happens is super important and super critical.
Flexibility and resilience.
Absolutely. That's correct. A second dimension is planning your sales and operations for a new reality, right? So it means embedding strategic analysis and also a scenario perspective for your decision making on planning, as well as speeding up your execution so that you can quickly replan, reschedule your supply chain once something deviates as well if you compare with your original plan, right? I think Lapo may have some examples on that.
Yeah, look, the scenario planning is so important because when supply chains are so complex, if you need to make a change in your execution, that change affects a very large number of stakeholders. So all those stakeholders need to be ready. And in order for them to be ready, they need to already have thought about what is the additional scenario that could happen in advance. So when you do your planning, you should have your plan for your A plan, but also should have your B and C, so that the whole chain is ready to quickly shift from one or the other.
Exactly. And for being ready to do this, right, I think another dimension that I would add, and it's an overarching dimension in the business, is adapting your operating model, right? Having an agile mindset, creating an organization that knows how to deal with uncertainty, knows how to deal with incremental improvements, and knows how to act fast whenever something goes out of the ordinary, as I said before, right? So this is super important, and digital and advanced analytics is part of this new operating model, and we'll be talking about this throughout the episode as well. So apart from the internal factors that you just talked about, there is also a very important external factors for companies to building resilience, right? Thinking about mainly about your sourcing partners, meaning that companies should be revising the sourcing strategy of their components, meaning they should understand where the weak points are and potentially think, should I have dual sourcings or multi-sourcings? Should I consider, for example, nearshoring, right? Localizing the production of some of the key components of the most critical ones, or even verticalizing such components if they are super critical and they are actually the weak points of your supply chain, right? Another point that is super critical is also to think about your logistics partners, right, Lapo? And I think you have good examples on that.
Yeah, so logistics, especially on complex and long supply chains, is a critical part and can make or break your performance. Where this works best is when you actually work with your stakeholders, like your third parties, in a true partnership. So you create as much transparency as possible, most likely also integrating digital systems so that you have very easy transfer of information, and align on targets. Like, for example, your partners need to be aware what is really critical for you and your customers, and prioritize their own actions based on that. So full transparency and integration is very important into making your logistics resilient.
Yeah, and I think as a final remark, it's important to say that building resilience, right? You are actually required to tackle both the internal and external factors. If you tackle only one of them, you are going to be short in the other side for sure. So it's super critical that you consider this in a holistic manner.
So we were talking about resilience and efficiency. So Lapo, how organizations can balance out efficiency, resilience over time? This is a trade-off that needs to be reassessed continuously, I imagine, right? But
Yeah.
How can we do it?
So it's a very hard balancing act, because on one hand, you could say, I'm super risk averse. I want to be ready for whatever happens. And you can do that, but that comes at a very high cost. On the other hand, you can say, look, I want to be as efficient as possible. So I'm going to keep my inventories very low. I'm going to have a very lean way of operating. And that could expose you to very high risk. So the balancing of those two is very difficult. And that's also where, as we were saying before, analytics comes in, because evaluating the trade-offs between all the different options you have is complex, especially in large, long, interconnected value chains. So you need to look at this balance, and as you were saying, it's not that you look at once and you have the answer forever. The balance needs to be adjusted as the market changes, as the environment changes, and as your risk exposure changes. So you need to repeat the exercise over time. How often? That's a very hard question, and depends on the sector and the geography you're operating, but also your ecosystem. Like, for example, if you are operating with spot contracts, then your exposure to market changes is much higher. So you will need to reevaluate this balance between resilience and efficiency very often, like on a weekly basis. If you have more long-term contracts, then you can do this evaluation still often, but not as much, for example, monthly or quarterly. And I would say, all in all, this exercise requires that you have a very good understanding of the data, and you have quick access to the data. Because if you need to repeat this very complex analysis on a continuous basis, of course, you don't want to have to make it a nightmare.
So Edson, I imagine that organizing such a huge amount of data, as Lapo was saying, is so nightmarish that no wonder supply chain is considered an unsexy subject, necessary but only visible when things go wrong. What do you think?
So Marina, this is where technology becomes such an important part of the solution, right? Having real-time visibility, having more accuracy, granularity, and agility on the way that you plan and execute your supply chain. These are core elements for managing supply chains nowadays, right? And that's where you have digital and advanced analytics solutions come in place to support, right, companies to tackle these challenges. I think a lot of people must be thinking on, do I have the right data to build, deploy such advanced technological tools, right? And the truth is, many companies, they wait to have the perfect data in order to act upon this tools deployment. And reality is that it is unlikely that you ever have the perfect data, the 100% ready and perfect for you to act. And this is what we see typically is you need to have at least the bare minimum that can provide you with reliable information for you to take decisions on a day-to-day, right? So you won't have never the perfect data, but you should start right now with the bare minimum necessary for taking your decisions.
And this is, Edson, where I think agility comes in. Because as you say, you're never going to have perfect data. So start with something and then improve it over time. You will find out of all the data you have, what is the data you really need to have accurately, what is the data that you can leave, even if it's not perfect. And you do these refinements over time so that you can start mitigating the effects of supply chain risk and not wait to have the perfect data, which will never come.
Absolutely. And it links back to one of the previous questions, right? That adapting your operating model is one of the dimensions for you to actually start building resilience in your supply chain.
Yeah, you're not going to have the perfect data and not the perfect scenario ever. So things are changing all the time. So that's we've seen. Yeah. So we're going to have another episode to talk specifically about technology and all of this that we were talking before. So we can deep dive in this opportunity.
Sure.
And this also ties into my next and final question for this episode, which is this complexity the main issue that makes decarbonization so difficult? I think Lapo can get this one.
Yeah, so decarbonization is difficult because, as you can imagine, you need to measure and act across all the different steps of your value chain. So both those aspects are difficult by itself, and also you need to coordinate all your stakeholders. So the path towards decarbonization, which is inevitable for all players, is one that actually requires very good planning upfront. And I would say typically we see three steps as we see companies approaching decarbonization. The first one is to define what is your starting point, what is your baseline, and what is the value that you want to get out of this journey. And value in the broad sense, not only financial value, but also value for your stakeholders and for the environment. Second, once you have defined your starting point and your objective, you need to define what is your pathway that is going to take you there. And as you were saying before, most likely you want to have more than one. So you're going to have multiple options on how to get to your objective. And finally, very important to keep tracking and being honest about your progress. It's a long journey, and it's going to see some hiccups along the way. So you need to be able to measure your performance and adapt your plan, being agile as you go towards decarbonization.
Okay, so being agile, I think it's in every topic that we've talked before.
Yes.
So do you want to add any final remarks or any final observations?
No, I think the only remark I would make is becoming resilient. I think it's not a choice, right? Companies, they must do that. It's a matter of when they will start acting upon that. And on what we see, the moment is right now, right? So starting to think on how to build resilience, how to adapting your supply chain, how to evolve your digital and analytics tools to support the decision making on the day-to-day. These are all factors that should be, top of mind for every single company in the world.
Great.
The only thing I would add is the journey we talked about is a difficult one. But also it's a big opportunity because given it's difficult, you need to actually have the combination of talent, technology, and processes to actually make it happen. So the companies that are going to be better at doing those three things are going to create an advantage amongst all the competitors.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Edson and Lapo, for this fantastic conversation. And we'll have next episodes to deep dive in certain topics. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mari.
Muito obrigada também a você que nos acompanha em vídeo ou em podcast. Para entrar em contato com os nossos especialistas ou enviar perguntas, o nosso e-mail é mckinsey-talks@mckinsey.com. E a nossa agenda completa está lá no mckinseytalks.com. Você também pode conferir lá este episódio e os anteriores em vídeo ou em podcast. E se você gosta do McKinsey Talks, compartilhe este episódio com seus amigos e colegas. É isso aí, muito obrigada e até a próxima!